Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. And I am very happy to welcome my guest today, who is Paul Levy. Hello, Paul.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Well, I'm very grateful because you have actually written the foreword to the book that I invited you to discuss today. And it is the Six Bardos of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And here is what it looks like. Um, and I think that this is a subject that's not particularly well known. And it might be good to begin with what is the Tibetan Book of the Dead?
Yeah, for sure. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's actually a really special book, and it's what's called a terma is the Tibetan word, and terma actually translates as a hidden treasure. So the because I've been a long time Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, and the lineage that I do practice in, it refreshes itself and keeps itself, really new and vital by the rediscovery of these hidden treasures. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead is one of them. In other words, it was authored by Padmasambhava, who was the founder of Tibetan Buddhism, but then it was hidden in the multidimensional fabric of the universe and discovered centuries later by the person who's destined to be the revealer of the treasure. So when you see the Tibetan Book of the Dead, some editions will say, "Oh, author Padmasambhava discoverer so and so," and there are two different people, and so it's a hidden treasure. So it has this incredible spiritual blessing energy to it, and it's really in very simple form. It's about it's written on the surface level for when somebody passes away to really help their consciousness to attain enlightenment in the bardo, which is the gap, the in between life and death and rebirth. But it's actually a hidden teaching on that every moment we're in a bardo, and all the instructions giving to the deceased person's consciousness actually maps on to us in our life. So it's a really, in a way, esoteric, mystically empowered text to help all of us to awaken.
So I'm just going to back up a little bit
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
you said that it was written and then it was hidden, and it was hidden in a kind of multidimensional state. Is that
Yeah.
what you?
The thing about these termas, and keep in mind, this isn't some sort of fairy tale. This is the scholars study this stuff. And every spiritual tradition has, I think, an idea of hidden spiritual treasures that a practitioner discovers. But in Tibet, they've so, kind of differentiated this and explored this idea of a terma. And so one way to think about it like there are these alarm clocks that are hidden in the multidimensional fabric of the dream that are designed to go off right when we need to awaken. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead is like that. Or think about them like keys that open locks or charms that break spells. That's the idea of a terma, of a hidden treasure. And and examples of terma, Tibetan Book of the Dead would be one of them. Or sometimes there'll be an incredibly blessed object that's hidden in the earth, or there'll be a practice or a prayer or a mantra that's actually hidden within a practitioner's mind in their unconscious. And then there'll be a lucidity stimulator, similar to how in a night dream, something will happen that'll make you recognize you're dreaming and you'll have a lucid dream. Well, those lucidity stimulators, that's my phrase, can be found in the waking dream, where all of a sudden, for example, somebody might see a syllable in a book and it'll open up their mind and they'll discover 20 volumes of text of a terma that'll just spontaneously come out just by that's catalyzed by seeing that one particular syllable. And so, and it's the way that the practice, the lineage, they keep It keeps on refreshing itself. And one way to understand it, it's very much like in individuals, person's process. If we get one-sided or off balance, we'll have a dream, and in the dream will be a symbol, symbols being the language of dreams. And if we get into resonance with the symbol, then all of a sudden we'll come back to our center. Same thing with terma, with the hidden treasures. It's like when we as a species or as a community of practitioners fall a little bit asleep, get a little bit dogmatic, become one-sided, become unconscious, we will dream up a terma, because terma is a dreamed up phenomena. All of this is based on that we're having a collectively shared dream right now. I mean, that is the realization that the Buddha was trying to get across. And so when we get off balance, just like in one person's process will dream up a symbol in their dream, we will dream up a terma, a hidden treasure, that will, if we get into alignment with it, will help us to awaken. And that's a way of understanding what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is. It is a terma, a hidden treasure. It's one of the most famous of the termas. And yeah.
So the idea is that it's there, and it was there, and then came the moment when somebody was ready to discover it. And that moment might be for me that when I decided to pick up this book and read it and invite you to come and have this conversation. Is that a good way of viewing it?
Well, that maps on. That's one iteration of a larger fractal. But in Tibet, the way it's conceived of is that the person who's fated to discover the terma, other people could come right where the terma is and they won't see it. Because in Tibetan Buddhism, they'll say the protectors, the Dharma protectors, will render the terma invisible until the moment. It's very much like I've had this experience, I imagine we all have, going into a supermarket and there's something I want to get, and I'm looking at the shelf right where I know it is, and I don't see it, and I'm looking right where it is, and I don't see it. And, it can go on for minutes, and I'm like, where is it? And then all of a sudden, there it is, and it's literally staring me in the face right in front of my eyes, but I just didn't see it. That is one sort of like, I think, way of understanding how until the moment when the terma is fated to come into our world and to be discovered, that, no one else can really find it. And it's such an interesting thing because when the person and the way it's conceived of in Tibetan Buddhism is that the person they're called tertan. That means the revealer, the discoverer of the terma, the hidden treasure. That it's conceived of that they were one of Padmasambhava, who is the founder of Tibetan Buddhism, who is the Buddha of our age, and he created the terma tradition because he knew there were like hostile negative forces that were endangering the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. So he figured out a technology. Oh, I can hide these teachings throughout the multidimensional fabric of the universe to protect them and safeguard them so that they won't be destroyed. And then like a time release vitamin right at the moment. So Padmasambhava was the one who created the terma tradition. And the person who discovers the terma is conceived of as being one of the 25 close disciples of Padmasambhava, that they got the appointment or the commission of like they were going to discover the terma in a future lifetime. And then when when the coincidence of factors happen and it's the right time, that's when they, synchronistically come across the terma and bring it into the world. So it's a very magical phenomena.
I like that very much, and I like the idea of it being hidden in this multidimensional um,
Yeah.
reality. It's a bit, and as you've said, and many of us have experiences of objects that disappear and then reappear in
Right.
in the oddest places. And I can give you an example of that. Only a week ago, my partner lost his keys, and they were missing for about 24 hours. And the next day, I I was doing something in the bedroom, and they were on the bed. the bed in which we had slept, the bed which had been made and unmade, the bed on which my dog had slept also on the top. It is inconceivable that
Yeah,
we
yeah,
would
yeah.
not have seen the keys, and more to the point, that we would not have heard them jingling
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
when we were moving about under the covers or when my dog was moving on the bed itself.
Right.
Inconceivable. So what happened to those keys? I suspect that they became invisible for a time for whatever reason, and then
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
became
Yeah.
visible again.
Yeah, no, totally. And then one way, I mean, that's a great example. And another, just this is not, because I don't want to appropriate terma, which is very, in Tibetan Buddhism, they have all these tests, and to make sure that it's a real terma, so I don't want to appropriate that as a Westerner. I'm just saying, no, that phenomena is found throughout different traditions. And even, for example, when somebody, say all of a sudden a song falls in their head and they create this amazing song that touches people all over the world. Well, where did that song come from? In other words, it was sort of just like sitting in the air, just waiting for somebody to tune in. It almost existed atemporally in a dimension outside of time. And then when somebody who was fated to, discover the song or got tuned in to this thing that was just waiting to be like, coagulated and given form, they all of a sudden, oh, this thing fell in my head, or any creative person, not just songs. You can think of it in that way. But the thing which is so interesting about terma is that the person who discovers it, they can't just share it. They have to say if it's a practice or a prayer or whatever mantra or visualization, they have to do the practice and attain the realization, the blessing of the terma before then they can offer it. And then they're empowered to offer it because termas are meant to be shared. It's a community dreaming. It's a a collective dreaming process. And so the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that the Khenpos, who've been my teachers for over 40 years, like I'm saying, that's a terma, and it's very, very profound. I mean, I'm happy to go into what it's actually saying at a certain point today. Yeah.
You also talked about the bardos, and I think
Yeah,
perhaps
yeah.
it might be helpful to have a more clear explanation, because you were talking about it being the period um, after we die. And if I'm correct in thinking, it's in between incarnations.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, there's not just one bardo. That's the bardo between death and rebirth. The word bardo, it literally translates as in between or gap. And so it's in between one state and another state when you're not in the first state, but you haven't come to the second state and you're in that transition period. That's the bardo. And it makes me think we are transitional beings. Each moment, this is a bardo that we're in right now. And so the idea being that because Tibetan Buddhism is incredibly accomplished in the area of really shedding light on what happens in the death process. And so just very simply, the idea that when we die, yeah, we leave our body behind, all of our possessions are behind. The one thing we have with us is the state of our awareness. And that's, why a practitioner is conceived of as practicing their whole life in preparation for the moment of death, because in that moment of death, they see that as an incredible opportunity to recognize our true nature and to have realization of our nature and to wake up and become enlightened, or however you would phrase it. But what typically happens, so now I'll get into what the Tibetan Book of Dead is really saying, if that's okay, is that they say when we die, and if at that first moment of death we don't recognize, which a lot of people who aren't practitioners don't recognize it, then it's like they're in a dream body, they're in a mental body, just like our dreams at night, and in a typical dream, you're in your dream ego, that maybe it's the same identity. In all probability it is, that you're habituated to being in your waking life. Oh, I'm a 68-year-old man and I'm in this dream universe, but I don't know it's a dream. Just like they say, oftentimes people die and they don't know they're dead because they're experiencing like being in a dream body and everything seems real and solid and separate. But what happens is that at a certain point, the idea, you see, what's the Tibetan Book of the Dead? It's conceived of that the Lama, the teacher, is reading out loud the instructions that are in the Tibetan Book of the Dead to the consciousness of the deceased. And in essence, there are all these different ways of saying the same thing. That what they're saying, the instruction to the person who's died is recognize everything you're experiencing is just your own projection, is the reflection of your mind, is your own energy. And if you realize that, you will attain realization. You'll wake up, you'll become enlightened. And so at first in Buddhist cosmology, they'll say, oh yeah, at a certain point you'll have visions of the peaceful Buddhas. And the Lama is instructing the consciousness, recognize it's all your own projection of your own nature. Recognize that. And they say it in all these imaginative, creative ways. And the Lama is actually saying it out loud. But then if the person's consciousness doesn't recognize it, the peaceful Buddhas become wrathful deities, very scary, look like demons. And at a certain point, the same thing, recognize it's all your own projection. But if the person doesn't recognize it, at a certain point, they'll become so overwhelmed with terror that they faint and they lose awareness. And that's the moment where they incarnate back into samsara, into the third dimensional space time. And the point is in the book, in the teachings, is that process that I just described, that's expressed via the Lama reciting the words to the deceased's consciousness, that's happening for us each and every moment. That those instructions are really for us. Do we recognize at this moment that exactly what we're experiencing in our bodies, through our senses, in our mind, through our awareness, is nothing other than a reflection of our Buddha nature? If we recognize that in this moment, we've woken up. But if we don't recognize it, then we're wandering in samsara, in the cycle of endless death and rebirth. And so that's where the Tibetan Book of the Dead, on one level, it seems like, oh yeah, it's instructions for the dead person, but on a deeper, more esoteric level, it's actually profound instructions for us to wake up in this moment.
So the idea is that the quicker we recognize that what we are projecting and our true nature, the better, and because then we are free. Is that
Yeah. It's very much like being in a dream at night and not realizing you're dreaming. So think about, you're in a dream. Here I'm in Portland, Oregon. I'm looking out my window. There's the city, buildings, cars, people, the whole thing. Seems real to me, seems not like a dream, but that I could be describing an ordinary night dream where I'm dreaming. I'm just sitting in my living room in Portland, Oregon, being interviewed. And say if all of a sudden, for whatever reason, I recognize that I'm dreaming, all of a sudden, what do I recognize? I recognize there's no external objective world out there, that this is not separate from my own psyche, that I'm actually not out of my mind, I'm inside my mind. I'm inside, that all of this is my own energy, that everything I'm seeing is my own projection, my own reflection. This is the teaching of the Buddha, of the enlightened one. This is what he realized. And I'm saying, so then you have a lucid dream, and then you're not controlling the dream, because why in the world would you do that? But you're controlling yourself. And then all of a sudden, all bets are off. The realm of the possible has increased to unimaginable degree.
so? Let's imagine that we've died, and we are recognizing that really this is not the true nature of things, that what we think is just a projection. what happens next? So we wake up to the fact that everything that we're seeing is a projection. What happens next? What do we
Yeah,
discover?
yeah, yeah. Well, what happens then you discover if everything is a projection, just think about what a projection is. Well, first off, what is a dream but a projection of the mind? Well, what is a projection? If I hold up an ink blot and I ask you, oh, tell me what you see. Well, say if you see a butterfly in that ink blot, it's not like one moment you see the butterfly and 2 moments later it appears. No, the viewing and the appearing are simultaneous, right? So in essence, you see, that's the nature that this is what the Buddha realized, that our nature is to be creative, and we've actually hypnotized ourselves by our own creative genius. So in other words, say if I'm in a dream, and if I'm holding a viewpoint in the dream being nothing other than a projection of my mind will give me all the evidence confirming the objective truth of the viewpoint. Now I get even more fixed. No, I'm seeing really accurately because I have all the proof I need. So I get more, fixed in that viewpoint. And the more fixed in that viewpoint, the dream will just, because it's just a reflection of my mind, will just reflect back that viewpoint ad infinitum. And what I'm describing is that I've put myself under a spell of my own making. No one else has done that. I've hypnotized myself by my own creative genius because I'm not conscious of the role I'm playing in creating my experience. So when you see that, and this is what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is transmitting, is openly revealing and instructing us to do. When you see that and you realize, oh, wow, I'm actually creating my experience. Whatever is happening in the dream is happening, but how I actually interpret what's happening, the meaning I place on it, actually creates my experience. And then all of a sudden, we become empowered. We become in touch with our creative agency, our creative power as creative individuals. And we can then create our night dream, waking dream, our life in a way that's in alignment with who we're discovering ourselves to be. And who are we? We are not a separate self. That's the illusion that we've entranced ourselves. We are interconnected and interdependent. And when you see that, your heart opens and, overflowing with love and compassion. And that's when you're getting in touch with your nature, because our nature is love, is compassion, and is by its nature creative.
That's just utterly beautiful. I'm just going to read a quote from the foreword that you wrote,
Yeah, yeah.
um, because I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. As if falling under a spell, we have succumbed to the chronic, habitual pattern of contracting against our own light and clinging to a false sense of a separate self. And this has fed a sense of lack and scarcity and a kind of existential insecurity about who we truly are. And this is exactly what you're talking about there. But it would be good for you to expand on that notion that this sense of separateness is actually creating an existential insecurity. Tell us a little bit more
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. What you just, the words that I had written that you just read, that in essence is the malady that our species has fallen under. I've written 3 books about there being a mind virus, and that is the mind virus right there. Because once we identify ourselves as being like an ego, or think of it like a separate self, then all of a sudden, as soon as I identify myself as separate from you, well, then you're an other. As soon as you're an other, then there's fear. And fear is the superfood for this mind virus. So then it just regenerates itself through that. One other way of talking about this, quantum physics is I point out, is a modern day analog to a terma, that those hidden treasures. And quantum physics has empirically proven, no, the idea of an objective world separate from us is an illusion. It's a nonsensical idea, has no correlate to reality. It's only an idea in our mind. But if we think the world exists objectively, well, then that feeds into our subjective experience of being a separate self. But then quantum physics is saying, oh, but there is no objective world. There's no objective anything. There's no things, right? Well, if there's no objective world, well, what happened to the subject? To be a subject, there has to be an object to be in relationship for me to be a subject. But if there's no objective world, then what happened to me? You see, because the experience of there being an objective world and the experience of me being a subject reciprocally reinforce each other. It's an illusion that continually regenerates itself and it reinforces itself. But when you actually see through that illusion, and that's what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is pointing at, then you realize, oh, there's no objective world. This is a dreamlike reality that's not separate from my own consciousness, and there's no separate self that's experiencing the world. That dispels that existential insecurity that I was referencing, and that opens your heart and makes you realize, oh, I'm connected with everybody and everything. That's to realize the oneness, of things. And that's the quantum nature, which is the Buddha nature. And that's what we're here to do. That's our mission, is to realize that. And I point out, for any of us, realizing that is the medicine for the incredible collective psychosis that we're acting out, in which we're just destroying ourselves. We're destroying the biosphere, the life support system of the planet, and we're destroying each other. And what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is pointing at is the medicine, is the antidote, is the cure for the very psychic illness that afflicts our species.
And I think too, we might add that there is a usefulness up to a point in understanding our individuality. But in honoring our individuality, it does not mean that we have to be separate. It's about understanding that individuals make up a choir, and the choir can sing in unity and harmony and
Right.
still honor the individual voices within it.
Yeah. And that's so right on, in the sense that, we have to develop a strong sense of ego, a strong sense of self, or when we meet, the archetypal powers of the universe or of the psyche. In the Bible, they talk about the powers and principalities. If we haven't developed a strong enough sense of self, we'll get devoured, we'll get possessed, we'll get dissociated and destroyed. So we have to develop that sense of ego, that sense of self, up to a point, exactly like you're saying. But then if we like stay identified in that way, no, then it's not serving us. Then we, at a certain point, we have to have realization that, oh yeah, this sense of existing as a separate self has served me, but now it's become antiquated and its expiration date has been reached, and it's becoming an obscuration, because at a certain point, you have to realize, oh yeah, that's the illusion. That's in essence the mind virus. The illusion is that we exist, and we think we exist in a way that we don't. And then we dream up evidence to confirm that. And that's insanity. And when 8 billion people are doing that together, you get a world, a nightmare like we're living in today.
I think it's very interesting to me that this is a theme that seems to be pretty universal. It crops up, in different ways in different cultures. And as we're talking, I'm thinking about Western astrology, being an astrologer myself, and the fact that the signs of the zodiac, all, it begins with that journey of Aries being the archetype of the pioneer, the young energy that's going out into the world, and learning and being self and discovering self. And the journey is one of self-discovery. But then by the time we get to Pisces, it's about the dissolution of self, and it's about oneness and coming back into that sense of being one with everything else, and compassion and the opening of the heart, as you speak. So this is there through so many traditions, this reminder that
Yeah.
we are a part of something, and that we are connected.
Yeah. No, totally. And it's interesting because in his work, the psychiatrist Carl Jung talks about that the sickness of our time is a sickness of disassociation, that we're inwardly disassociated, based on trauma, and that inner split, it gets dreamed up into the polarization and the fragmentation that we see in the world today. And the idea is for any one of us doing our inner work and sort of retrieving our soul or remembering, putting our members back together, which is actually, there's a word that I love, not amnesia, which is forgetting, anamnesia, which is an unforgetting. And you're like remembering who you actually are. When any one of us, when we do that, we're actually that realization immediately gets registered in the collective consciousness of our species, because we're like so extremely polarized right now. But I'm pointing out that's a reflection of what's going on inside of our mind. And this is exactly what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is pointing at, that the seemingly external world you're experiencing is actually reflecting, expressing, revealing the very inner state of your psyche. And when you recognize that, that's to recognize the dreamlike nature. Because when you're in a dream, the outer dream world is reflecting your inner psyche, because the two are the same. And when you recognize the dreamlike nature, that's when you become empowered to be a lucid dreamer and to be really genuinely of help.
That is absolutely wonderful. You have very clearly indicated what we are all meant to be remembering.
Yeah.
The the fact that we are, let's put it in a different way, that we are more than these physical beings on this planet, that we are spirit, that we are more than just the physical, that we are indeed consciousness, and that when we remember that we are consciousness, then everything becomes possible.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing about this particular book that I wrote the forward, the teachers, the two lamas, the kempos, is what their students call them. They are, I've known them. I've studied with them for over 40 years. They're like the most unbelievable embodiment of love and compassion. They're these genuinely realized beings who are like these bodhisattvic beings who are here to help. That's their whole mission in life. And so, I'm just a beginning student. They're giving such an incredible transmission by their commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the bardos. I just can't, because there are so many people who are putting shingles, oh, I'm an enlightened person. And a lot of them are really sketchy. But I just want people to understand that these are two of the greatest lamas in the world, and I like I say, I've known them. They're like family to me, and I just can't endorse their commentary enough on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, really.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for talking to us today about this beautiful book. And just a reminder, it is The Six Bardos of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Here it is. I will be putting a link to it in the description box. And Paul, if people want to find you and find out more about your work, how do they do that?
Oh, well, okay, thanks. Yeah, the way I'll say it is that if you're interested, if you want to awaken in the dream, go to awakeninthedream.com. So AWAKEN inthedream.com. And there's a ton of articles all for free, a ton of interviews like this all for free. I get criticized that it's not monetized, but I want to get this is medicine, this information. So I just want to share it. And yeah, then people can buy autographed books or book a session, but I just really want to get this work out so they can go to awakeninthedream.com.
Wonderful. Well, you've probably noticed this isn't monetized either for exactly the same reason.
Right. Totally. Totally.
So, thank you very much. And thank you all for watching. A little reminder that I have started a Substack, and on there you will find the wonderful tales of me and my dog. Um, little articles about plants that you might find useful, and also information about the full moons, new moons, everything that's going on from an astrological perspective. Until next time, and next time we're going to be looking at breath work. Have a fantastic week. Goodbye.